As private citizens, when we lose a loved one, we are generally left to grieve in private. Unfortunately, for celebrities and their families, they're not so lucky. The latest high-profile celebrity death is seen as the next money-making magazine story. It's true that celebrities call publicity, but their bereaved families do not. George Michael's death shook multiple communities and sent the media into a frenzy to see who could get the most coverage of the singer's death. It's true there's no better tribute to an artist than celebrating their lives and achievements long after they have stopped creating these memories. However, when 1 in 5 publications is more focused on where George Michael's private funeral will be and which celebrities will be present, it's hard to accept that this is journalism at its finest. It's unreasonable to expect a journalist to resist the urge of capturing the latest celebrity tragedy. The issue doesn't come down to whether the story should be done or not. It's about whether it's been handled correctly and ethically. Sadly, tabloid journalists aren't all that concerned with the effect their stories have on people. They just want to sell magazines. For this reason, tabloid style is constantly seen as inferior, appealing to base instincts and public demand for sensationalism. However, when it's a question of covering not just the death, but the death of a celebrity, like George Michael, there should be no room for the ethical debate. People want to know the gossip, but is it wrong to exploit it? Journalists are first and foremost truth seekers. They should be honest, accurate, and fair to who they report and what they report about. By undermining ethical concepts such as privacy and public policy and engaging heavily in tabloidization can lead some journalists into compromising positions that pushes them to cut ethical corners. If we look at these factors separately, it will come to fruition that tabloid gossip has no place in mainstream media. George Michael's death exemplified the pressure journalists feel to be the first on scene to get that exclusive interview, and how this can get in the way of their personal ethics. Unfortunately, the process for reporting privacy is as follows. If the person is a private individual and their death takes place in private, do not report it. It's unethical. That changes if a private person dies publicly. Semi-unethical, but could make an interesting, newsworthy story. That changes again if the person is a public figure who dies either privately in their home or in public. Ethics are gone, and it's a good story. Having experienced firsthand the copious amounts of people and reporters camped out on George Michael's doorstep after the news of his death broke, it became evident that the concept of privacy is thinly respected at best. The public and tabloids were thriving off his family's heartache. However, privacy is not only a question of physical presence. Intrusive articles are also considered an invasion of privacy. As any family's right, George Michael's family wanted to farewell him in peace. However, gossip rags like The Sun, publishing details of his private funeral and family memorial, is an intrusion of privacy from afar. If respecting of a family's grief and privacy is the last consideration for tabloid journalists, maybe there really is no room in mainstream media for a journalism with a lack of precaution against poor taste when reporting celebrity tragedies. Tabloid journalists usually justify these efforts of intrusion by claiming the stories within the public interest. But how does one measure public interest? It's rather subjective depending on the topic. George Michael, for example, was an outstanding musician, gay icon, and beacon of hope for the underdog. Thus, it is clear the public interest was revolved around sharing his life, celebrating all he achieved and did for people, not how much money he was leaving behind. It is even more offensive that to try and appeal to this audience, the Daily Star claims they communicated with George from beyond the grave, and he says he's okay. Tabloids are only concerned with what they believe the public wants to read, not what the public actually wants to read. It could be argued that this information is ethically correct if it is satisfied by the public interest test, being not what the public would be interested in, but rather, is there an important reason as to why this information needs to be shared? As there is no importance behind the fortune of George Michael or a claim he has spoken from beyond the grave, To report such things are contradictory to mainstream news standards of harm minimization and increased discretion required when reporting tragedies. The neglect for what is required to appeal to the ethical obligations of privacy and public policy is what makes up tabloidization, which could not be more evident than in the reporting of George Michael's death. It exemplified that an entertaining story does not mean replacing worthy news stories with embellishments or incidentals. The first stories published about George Michael's death were poor health and suicide before any accurate diagnostic was actually given. Rather than tabloids posting retractions with the confirmed cause of death, they posted further stories about him discussing his death from beyond the grave, quoting, "They say I died of natural causes, head and liver, but the truth is I chose to leave. I was tired and depressed." Thus, tabloidization. Justifying false information with something so over-exaggerated made the last story not look so questionable. Sadly, these articles detract from other articles floating around that genuinely had nice things to say about George. Rolling Stone published a tribute to him, filled with messages of sadness, praise, thanks and love from his friends, family and colleagues. Whereas The Sun was primarily concerned with who would inherit his money and his past lovers attending his funeral. This is what is fundamentally unethical about tabloids. They produce stories focusing on the circumstances of George's death rather than the achievements of his life. Although it may be true that tabloid journalists cover the same topics as mainstream journalism, to some extent, it's generally done more briefly and flamboyantly, thus evidencing how the high standards of yesterday are being undermined by the sensationalism, triviality, and in some cases malice, undermining all journalists' ethical obligations. There you have it. As a whole, we thrive off information we are fed. Some of us long for stories that uplift and celebrate, and others, possibly a majority, long for mindless, untrue gossip. However, it is not our job to differentiate between the two. It's for journalists to call upon their ethical duty to share newsworthy, impactful stories rather than gossip for a profit. This line was blurred when it came to George Michael's death. Ethics were overlooked, privacy was invaded, public policy was not considered in full ethical force, and tabloidization took over.